Today we're going to talk about George W. Bush, Bush 43, the 43rd President of the United States, the son of George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States. So first of all, if we're going to cover the election of 2000, it's one of the more controversial elections in recent history. The election of 2000 pitted Bush. So Bush comes from a pretty wealthy family. I think we mentioned before that his father owned his own oil company. So Bush was the son of an oil giant and he had a lot of money. And when you've got a lot of money, you can take up hobbies like maybe buying a professional baseball team. Yes, George W. Bush owned the Texas Rangers for a while. He has since sold the team, but he did own a baseball team and he did kind of okay with it. They made money on the team, but the team never really won much of anything. But from there, he got involved as governor of Texas in 1994. He will become governor of Texas, and then he's got his eye on the presidency, following in his father's footsteps. So, when he chooses to run, it is important to note that there are certain states that are important to win, and these are what are called swing states. We know that most of the states, we already kind of know how they're going to go in the Electoral College. We know that most of the states on the East Coast and the West Coast are going to go for the Democrats. We know most states in the South are in the West, but not on the West Coast, are going to go for the Republicans. And then those states where we don't really know whether a Democrat or Republican is going to win are called battleground states, or sometimes they're called swing states. And in 2000, the exit polls, so polls that were taken at the end of the election, so some of these exit polls, early on in the election, early on election night, started to show that Al Gore was going to win the election, that Al Gore would win, and so they predicted that Gore was going to be the winner. However, these are not official counts, they're just guesstimates based on asking people when they walk out of the polls. And later, one of the stations went on TV and they changed their prediction. They didn't know if Bush was going to win, they didn't know if Gore was going to win, they said it's too close to call. And from that point, pretty much everybody went to bed, and by 2 a.m., the TV stations had changed their mind, and this time they had declared George W. Bush the winner. And so, needless to say, this is going to make a lot of people a little bit skeptical, and it's going to upset a lot of people. This was the first election that I ever got to vote in, and I remember being a geeky political science student. I was in college at the time, and I remember being out with a bunch of other political science people. My department in college had a party to watch the election results, and I remember being disappointed because they called the party before the election was actually called. So we went home, and needless to say, around 2 in the morning, some of the TV stations started to declare George W. Bush the winner, which leads us to a lot of controversy in the election. Well, Bush was declared the winner specifically because he was able to win in the state of Florida. The state of Florida was an extremely close election. In fact, the difference between Bush and Gore was about 500 votes. And anytime you have an election that's that close, there's automatically a recount that's going to take place. They automatically recount the ballots just to make sure that there's no mistakes. So, when they call for the recount, that is when Al Gore is going to request what is called a manual recount. He doesn't want everything run through machines, and he's got the right to request that everything be counted by hand. And so Gore is going to insist that everything be counted by hand. When Gore requests a manual recount, one of the things that people were objecting to was the way that the ballots were written. The way that things worked in Florida at the time, in order to vote, they used a punch card system. And so like you see in the photo, essentially you would look at the lines and you would punch out the little bubble that you wanted to vote for whatever candidate. And as you can see, it's kind of a little bit tricky to see which arrow is pointing for which candidate. Now, to make things even more complicated is when you look at the punch card system, the more they are handled, the more that sometimes you can accidentally punch out some of the other options. And so when you're looking at these punch cards, if you look in the picture, you'll notice that many of them are kind of punched. Now, some of them are fully punched, some of them are halfway punched, And this is where the manual recount gets tricky. This is where Bush sues and gets pretty upset because he says, look, if more than one bubble is punched out, then that means that that vote is invalidated. And the question becomes, is more than one thing punched out because the voter got it wrong, or is it incorrect because the system is messed up and because somebody had mishandled it and touched it several times with the manual recount? And so this is going to lead to a lot of problems. People in the state of Florida are going to sue not only over the manual recount, but also about the way the punch card lines up. As you can see, the bubbles were a little bit difficult to read. Sometimes people were voting for people that they probably might not otherwise would have voted for. And needless to say, the case is going to go directly to the Supreme Court. It is the Supreme Court case of Bush versus Gore. 1 month after the election actually takes place, the Supreme Court steps in and they decide that the winner of the election is going to, it's going to be whoever is the winner, but they're going to say that that you got to stop the recount. They say that one of the reasons why the recount must stop immediately is because there's no uniform standards for counting them. Because there's no specific way. One precinct or one county would count one way, another would count another, and by mishandling them, by manhandling them, you could have fraud. You could have some of those little bubbles. The bubbles, by the way, are called chads. You could have some of the chads punched out, and that could lead to fraud. And so based on the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, essentially they say the recount must stop immediately, and by doing that, they essentially declared that George W. Bush is going to win the election of 2000. And as you can see, it's a pretty close election. When things are all said and done, Bush actually does not win the popular vote in America. He gets 47.9% of the popular vote compared to 48% for Gore. However, it is not the popular vote that matters. What matters is the Electoral College, and George W. Bush will win by the minimum margin, 271 votes, or 50.5% of the Electoral College votes. It's a very controversial election. It's one that leaves America not really too thrilled. There's a lot of controversy at the time. A lot of people are upset about the election of 2000, and that's going to hinder W for most of his presidency. People go in with a bad taste in their mouth, and it's going to stay that way throughout the most of the rest of his presidency. That brings us to the economy. We know that under Bill Clinton, things were pretty good in the economy. We know that there was a budget surplus for the first time in over 30 years. The government was bringing in more money than it was spending. And Bush decided that, well, instead of bringing in all this money and paying down the national deficit, instead, we should give that money back to the people. He said that if we're bringing in more money than we need to spend, then that money should be given back to the people. And so he introduces a $1.35 trillion tax cut, which at the time is the largest tax cut in American history. Since has been surpassed, but at the time, the largest tax cut in American history. And this is significant because, the economy is kind of doing okay towards the middle of the 90s. By the time we hit the early 2000s, the economy is starting to struggle a little bit. Now, it's not doing bad. It's not doing terrible. It's not a recession. But things are starting to fall a little bit. And, well, Bush wants to get the economy going again. And so he says, let's give money back to the people. Let's give the money back to the people. Now, where he gets a lot of criticism is most of the tax cuts went for the wealthy. The other question is, does it work? And the answer is instantly, yeah, he does stimulate the economy. Things start to work. By June of 2001, things are going really well. The economy is getting good. People are happy with the tax cuts. They're spending the money, but then something happens. Yes, if you haven't guessed it yet, September 11, 2001 happens. We're going to talk a whole lot more about September 11th in a separate lesson, but for now, keep in mind that once September 11th happens, we're going to spend a lot of money trying to fight the war on terror, and that combined with the tax cuts is going to lead to a growing amount of debt. So between tax cuts and between the war on terror, we're going to see the deficit of America rise significantly. So again, one of the difficult things to measure with Bush's presidency is what would have it been like without September 11th. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury. One thing we do know is that by June of 2007, the national debt is growing at a pretty quick pace, and the United States is going to enter the Great Recession of 2008, or what is considered the largest recession since the Great Depression. So things, while they started out pretty good, we're not going so well by the middle to the end of Bush's presidency. That brings us to domestic policy. So what's going on at home? It's interesting that George W. Bush campaigned on the idea that he didn't know much about foreign policy. His entire campaign was vote for me because I'm going to focus on America and America first and America at home and forget about foreign policy. However, when September 11th happened, pretty much the entire fate of his presidency changed, and the president will focus probably more effort and attention on foreign policy than he ever wanted to or than anyone ever wanted him to. But in essence, one thing that we're going to go for is we will talk a little bit about the domestic policy, some of the things that Bush does get done at home. One of the things he does is he works with the Democrats and he comes up with a policy called No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind is an education policy that basically says if we are going to have kids go to school and if we're going to fund schools at the government level, the national government level, then we should measure to see if those schools are effective. We should measure to see if those schools are doing what they're supposed to be doing. There was a plan that Clinton had put in place that said there should be voluntary testing to see if states are actually doing what they say they're doing, but No Child Left Behind mandates it. It says we got to measure what students do or don't know, and based on that, we're going to determine whether or not a school is effective. And what we mean by effective is, do they meet their target goals? Is the school doing what they're supposed to be doing? And the idea behind this is that you don't want to give any money to a school that's not actually getting the job done. You wouldn't sink money into a sinking ship. You wouldn't put money into an unfixable project, and essentially that is the idea behind No Child Left Behind. The idea is that schools that struggled would be closed down, and that the students who went to those schools would then have the opportunity to attend a different school that was not struggling. Needless to say, this ends up becoming a pretty controversial plan, especially among teachers, because teachers have the potential to lose their jobs. Students, of course, don't like No Child Left Behind either, because throughout the course of it, it means they've got to take more tests. You want to know why you take so many standardized tests these days? A lot of it goes back to the idea of No Child Left Behind. Even though Barack Obama came up with a new policy called Race to the Top, most of the states still keep the testing component of No Child Left Behind in their state testing policy. This brings us to the election of 2004. By 2004, things have calmed down a little bit. The election of 2004 is an incredibly close race. Certainly, there are people on both sides of the aisle. There are many people who are very happy with the way George Bush is handling the presidency. They're pretty happy with the way he is fighting the war on terror and his leadership through September 11th, and the fact that the economy may be getting a little, well, the economy is sort of doing okay at this point in time. However, there are a lot of Americans who are upset with the war on terror. The war on terror, while initially a success, is eventually going to kind of drag on and cost a lot of money and a lot of lives. And the longer the war drags on, the more upset people are. Every day on the news, we get talks and reports of more and more people dying, more and more people being killed in the war effort, specifically American military, and that's not going to sit well with the American public. Another thing that was pretty controversial is one of the reasons why we went to war with Iraq as part of the war on terror is because the president claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. To be fair to Bush, most of the intelligence reports at the time did state that there were weapons of mass destruction there. We at least suspected that they had weapons of mass destruction. However, by 2004, it becomes pretty clear that there are not weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and because of that, a lot of people think that Bush lied about his reasoning for going to war. A lot of people think that the only reason why Bush went to war was to, quote, finish what his daddy started. We know that George H.W. Bush was not able to kill Saddam Hussein in the Persian Gulf War way back in the early 90s. That was never the mission at the time. That was never the goal at the time. So he didn't really fail at his mission. But by this point in time, a lot of people think that Bush just wants revenge for what his father wasn't able to do. That puts him against a guy named John Kerry. We had the opportunity to meet Senator Kerry on the close-up trip a couple years ago. There you can see us with Senator Kerry. But it's going to be an incredibly controversial and incredibly close election. But this time, Bush is going to win by at least a little bit more of a margin than he did the time before. He will this time win the popular vote. And so by a rate of 50.7%, he wins the popular vote, and he gets 53.2% of the Electoral College vote. Huge voter turnout in that election, so things look pretty good. Things are kind of heading on the right track from that point on for Bush. Still, his presidency is going to be marred with a lot of controversy. A lot of people still aren't really happy with the way things are going, but at least it's a step in the right direction. And then a hurricane happens. And if you're wondering, well, what does this have to do with anything? The first thing that we have to do is we have to look at how New Orleans was built. On August 28, 2005, a hurricane hits the city of New Orleans and really the coast of Louisiana. And this becomes essentially problematic because New Orleans is sitting below sea level. As you can see, the only thing that's keeping New Orleans from flooding are these wall systems. They're called levees. And when the hurricane hits, it's going to knock out the levees, which is going to cause water from the Lake Pontchartrain to essentially enter the city, and it's going to create terrible flooding. By the time things are all said and done, about 80% of New Orleans is going to be underwater. It's going to be completely flooded. It's going to be completely destroyed. It's going to be a disaster of epic proportions. Now, to make matters worse, whenever a national disaster happens, it is the job of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to really deal with the emergency, to decide when to evacuate and to decide what to do in the cleanup process. And well, FEMA basically got this situation as wrong as they possibly could. By 10 o'clock on Sunday night, the Sunday of the hurricane, they pretty much made an announcement that the hurricane was coming. By Monday morning, the hurricane is actually going to make land, but yet at this point in time, they have still not chosen to evacuate. Now, what makes things especially problematic is that a lot of the people needed to take public transportation out. They didn't have cars, they didn't have a way to get out, and so a lot of people kind of sit around, and especially a lot of people living in poverty, they're kind of hanging out and they're waiting, and they get trapped in the hurricane. And so this is where things get really, really tricky. A lot of people said that the evacuation should have been announced a lot sooner than 10 p.m. on a Sunday night. That they knew that this was happening, that they knew this was coming, and that we should have got the people out of there a whole lot sooner. And so the end result is that a lot of people are trapped in New Orleans. Thousands of people will die. And on top of that, a lot of people are left to go to wherever they can. And so they set up a temporary shelter in the Superdome. The Superdome, of course, is where the New Orleans Saints, the NFL, the football team, plays. And this is what things look like on the days following the hurricane itself. Now, this leads to a whole lot of other problems because while they're there, there's not enough food, there's not enough clothing, there's not enough water. FEMA messes up the effort to get stuff in. And so now not only do you have the poor people who have died, but you've got the people living in poverty. They can't get food, they can't get water, and things inside the Superdome turn nasty. When things are all said and done, there's rape, there's murder, there's theft, there's a lot of assault, there's battery. It's a really, really nasty situation that the police can't handle, and so that makes Hurricane Katrina look even worse. Altogether, the hurricane itself was the seventh most intense hurricane in American history. It was the fifth deadliest. 1,833 people will die as a result of the hurricane, and most of them being in Louisiana and a few in neighboring states, Mississippi. Overall, it's going to cause over $81 billion worth of damage, and a lot of that damage is, in fact, in the lower income sections of the city. And it's unfortunately not only a lot of high poverty, but it's also a predominantly African American community that is going to get destroyed. And this is where things are going to fall under even more criticism for Bush, because when the hurricane breaks out, when the hurricane's over and all this poverty is going on, FEMA has a long time declaring an emergency site and getting some of this stuff to rebuild. In fact, here we are 15 years later, and we still don't have everything completely rebuilt. A lot of the areas that were hit by the hurricane that are in the downtown business district owned by wealthy people, those things have been rebuilt. And New Orleans, if you go today, is beautiful. It's doing nice. But if you go into the further communities where a lot of the people living in poverty lived, a lot of that stuff still isn't even rebuilt to this day. FEMA, again, gets a lot of criticism. They are criticized because they weren't prepared for the hurricane in the first place. And then when it came time to start rebuilding, they weren't prepared for that. In many cases, there was a delayed response in getting the funding and the money that they need to rebuild. Again, it took over 10 weeks to authorize the funds. Now, imagine being somebody who can't really afford to rebuild. You've lost your house, you've lost your home, you've lost everything, and now you don't have any money, you can't rebuild, you can't get any insurance money until FEMA authorizes that money. It's an all-around bad situation. Now, to make matters even worse, is if this is not bad enough, this is where Bush falls under a lot of criticism. Number one, as president, as commander-in-chief of the United States, he is the head of FEMA. Now, chances are he had very little to do with the lack of preparation. That's not really his job and his purview. But when things go good, we give the president a lot of credit, and when things go bad, we give the president a lot of blame. And in this case, the president is going to get a lot of blame. To make matters worse, when things happened, um, they asked Bush if he wanted to visit the site, and he was on his airplane. He was on Air Force One, and he flew over. He surveyed things from the air, but he didn't want to land. Later in his biography, when they asked Bush, well, why didn't you go down there? Why didn't you check things out? Bush said, well, I didn't want to land because if I land, then you're going to have a Secret Service crew around me, and you're going to have to take police and firefighters and workers away from rebuilding, and instead they're going to have to focus on my safety. And he didn't want to do that. But at the time, it just seemed like usually when natural disaster strikes, presidents go, they give speeches, they do their thing, and a lot of people viewed Bush as being insensitive to the needs of the lower income families, and especially to the African Americans at the time. And so it was just a really poorly managed situation. In class, we're going to watch a video called When the Levees Broke, and that's all I've got for you for now. We will talk a little bit more about the Bush presidency, namely with what happened in September 11th, but because that's such a big event, we're going to spend an entire couple days on September 11th. For now, have a wonderful day.